Welcome to episode 94 of the Cycling Europe podcast.
Hi, I'm James Briggs. I'm the author of a new book called From Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, a Bowie Odyssey, which has just been released. In 2016, after Bowie's passing, like many of us, I was inconsolable. I took solace in his music and classics like Life on Mars, whose lyrics had beguiled and befuddled me in equal measure. One day in the shower, I was sadly and tunelessly singing the eternal lines, "See the mice in their million hordes, from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads." Towel around my tubby mid-30s waist, I passed my bike in the hallway and a lightning bolt of inspiration struck. I should cycle that. I should be the first Wally to cycle a song lyric. I created what I called a star map, a loosely plotted constellation of his artistic cosmos across Europe, with the foolish notion I'd cycle off and finally discover what life on Mars, and maybe what my own life on Earth, really meant. Over 2 months, I cycled around 3,000 miles, from Ibiza to Spanish Olympic stadiums where he played his Sound and Vision tour in Barcelona, over the Pyrenees Mountains and into France, to the home of a French singer, Claude Francois, whose song Bowie had been asked to re-record, only to be told he'd been beaten to the punch by another tune, Frank Sinatra's My Way. In an act of musical revenge, Bowie wrote Life on Mars, his own planetary epic. Indeed, if you look at the hunky-dory album sleeve on which the song features, there's a cheeky wink, a note that says, "Inspired by Frankie." As my creaking legs chunted to Switzerland, Germany and Holland, to stadiums he played and studios he recorded, I saw cuckoo clock houses on the banks of Lake Geneva where he lived, and in a slight break from Starman Supercool, drove a Volvo. It was also where he recorded a slew of late 80s and early 90s albums, and the gorgeously nuts Under Pressure, trading dueling vocals with Freddie Mercury. I gave my bike a name, Iggy, after Iggy Pop, Bowie's great friend, collaborator and hellraiser. After learning they'd hopped on a train to the former Soviet Union, I did likewise. I was a passenger on an almighty detour from Paris to Moscow, where Bowie's music was banned. Peering behind the Soviet curtain, I learnt how an underground black market had formed for his records, how he had a legion of fans, and how he finally came to play to stony-faced officials in the Kremlin Palace. Looking for clues to the mysteries of life on Mars, I cast my net wider. Bowie wasn't only an influencer, he was a person of influences. I discovered how he learnt stagecraft from mime artists like Lindsay Kemp, blurred gender lines with Japanese costume and Arabic-influenced makeup, and musically, as I cycled my way across a frozen Germany, how I'd fallen in love with the cosmic music of Can, Neu and Kraftwerk, whose sound would inspire his Berlin trilogy. I'd come to Bowie in a weird way. As a 90s kid, I'd missed his 70s pomp, but knew the hits from the radio. Yet strangely, it was his 90s album, Earthling, and the song Little Wonder, a drum and bass cut-up extravaganza featuring the Seven Dwarfs, which had me diving deeper into his musical stratosphere. When I finally saw him at Glastonbury in the last hopping over the fence years, I was smitten. This cosmic journey brought some remarkable highs, like the recording of his album Low. I bluffed my way into the honky chateaux, a supposedly haunted recording studio outside of Paris where Bowie, Elton John, the Bee Gees and the Grateful Dead had all recorded. My phony credentials meant the village mayor turned up, and I was serenaded on the original Steinway piano Bowie and other artists would have played. Then, again after flashing my dodgy journo badge, I was given a private tour of Berlin's Hansa Studios, where Bowie had recorded Heroes. I was invited to look from the window, where he'd supposedly seen two lovers kiss as the guns shot over their heads, and I felt the history and sound waves crackling all around me. Of course, there were lows. My bike saddle fell off. French village shops barely opened past midday. And one day I ran out of water. Existing only on cheap cheese and in 35-degree heat, I got sunstroke. Or there was a time I chose to cycle 13 kilometres up an Ardèche mountain to a village named St Pierre-le-Roc. Just like Bowie's makeup man Pierre Leroc. He was the one who designed his iconic Aladdin Sane lightning bolt. But would this namesake village offer clues to the mysteries of life on Mars? No. I learnt many things. That if you're barreling along the Burgundy Canal mouth wide open to sing on Life on Mars at full volume, you will swallow midges. And as I asked people what they thought the song meant, from Lithuanian truckers, Dutch caravan club members, Russian ballerinas, and a Cliff Richard fan wearing a ski jacket in Suffolk, I learnt the song could mean many different things to many different people. I hope that anyone who reads the book will not only fall ever deeper in love with David Bowie's music, but also his curiosity and adventure, how his open mind travelled across cultures and borders, how he saw inspiration everywhere, not only in lovers, but surrealist Spanish art, German plays, Japanese fashion, the totalitarian landscapes of Russia, and the bright burning cosmos above us. I also hope they agree what a wonderful journey life on Mars is, and that maybe they find their meaning in it too. Bowie forever.
That was James Briggs talking about his new book, From Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Now, back in 2020, for episode 23 of the podcast, I interviewed James about the journey that he'd made from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, inspired by the lyric from David Bowie. And in this episode of the podcast, we're going to listen to that interview again, but also we're going to catch up with James to hear what happened after he spoke to the podcast and about the new book, which has just been published in 2025. So, to begin with, we're travelling back in time to episode 23. It was 2020, and this is what James had to say at the time.
I'm from the West Country originally, but I've been in London for about 10 years now. Cycling-wise, these days, I commute to work every day, and I go for a weekend ride every few weeks. Sometimes a long day ride, sometimes a shorter ride. So I guess I'm a casual cyclist, I'd say.
Had you done any cycle touring before the trip that we're going to talk about?
No, I hadn't done any at all, actually. It was always something in the back of my mind to do, but it always felt like one of those things that other people do, I think. You know, the sort of Instagram is full of stories and pictures these days. And then there's books like your own book that you read. But yeah, it always seemed like a really romantic way to see the world, but I never thought it would actually be me that did it.
How did you first come up with the idea of cycling the route that we're going to talk about in a few minutes?
By happenstance, really. It was a bit of a lightning bolt one day. I was having a bit of a tough time of it at work, and I was feeling quite down, working lots of long hours. And David Bowie had just passed away a few months before. So I think he was in everyone's consciousness at the time. You know, there was a lot of news stories about him. Everyone was hearing a lot of his music. And I was there on a Monday morning waiting to go to work, face another week. I think I just passed my bike in the hallway. I was singing Life on Mars in the shower, just sort of mumbling away, singing really terribly. And I spat out the words, see the mice in their million hordes from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, which is one of the lyrics. And something just clicked at that moment. And it sort of like connected in my brain, all these atoms firing around it. But yeah, I should cycle that for some reason. But yeah, it was kind of a bit of divine intervention from above, from Bowie maybe. I don't know. But yeah, it just seemed like, yeah, why not? Bit of serendipity, cycle from one place to the other.
Most people, if they sing stuff in the shower, most of them, by the time they get out of the shower, let alone the following day or the following week, have probably forgotten all about it. What made you continue your thoughts, and what made you actually carry it through and cycle from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads?
I think because he was so prevalent at the time and in the news, it stayed with me. And there'd probably been something that I'd wanted to do this for a long time, but maybe I hadn't found quite the inspiration for the route I wanted to do. And this just seemed like a great way to do it. I didn't quite know what I was going to do, cycling from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads particularly. And then the more and more I thought about it, I sort of had a look at the route one day, just like, I wonder how far it actually is. And I think on Google Maps, it came in at about 100 hours, which is something like, 4 days continuous cycling without any sleep. So you'd probably be able to do that in a week, I guess. But sort of being a fan of Bowie, and then as the idea kind of formed a lot more in my head, I was kind of thinking, well, like he lived in Berlin, he played in Moscow. I'm sure he'd played everywhere in Europe. I knew he'd recorded albums in different parts of Europe as well. So with the wonder of Google, I started to look things up, and I kind of ended up creating this, I called it like a star map, really. And it was all these random blobs around Europe where he'd played, or he'd recorded, places he'd actually lived as well. Like he lived in Switzerland for 20 years, for example. And I think once you started to map it out, at some point there's no turning back, really. It just gets harder and harder to not do.
What was the reaction of other people when you told them that you intended to cycle from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads based upon the lyric of David Bowie?
There were a few people who were just like, that's weird. A few people said, well, Bowie's weird. And then one or two people said, you're a bit weird as well. But there are other people who thought, it sounds really fun. Like it sounds like quite an interesting thing to do. A bit daft, but an interesting thing to do. And then I think one of my friends said, yeah, but what are you going to do in, the hundreds of miles between two cities, for example, where he played? I'd already kind of mapped out the route by then. So, yeah, I was well on my way, really. But I think like that's kind of the attitude of Bowie anyway. He's don't care what other people think. If you want to do something, do it your own way. Go your own way, I guess.
So between the shower moment and you setting off, how long a period was that?
I think it was a couple of months or so. I was doing research along the way, and then obviously I was trying to think about how I'd do it on a bike, because at the time I had this beat up old racer, and I was a little bit naive about cycle touring. I didn't really know that you needed not necessarily you need one, but it's recommended you have a touring bike. So I'd gone into a bike shop one day and asked the guy behind the counter, I said, can I have some, bags for this, so I can go off around Europe? And basically just laughed me out of the shop at the time. He said it will pretty much fall apart as soon as you put anything on it, that bike. So that was a rude awakening. So fortunately, I was on the cycle to work scheme. It was kind of a reasonably affordable way to do it, because you can pay it off over up to 18 months, I think. So I wasn't having to pay back too much straight away, but obviously I had the bike straight away. Yeah, and then it was kind of like, do I do some training beforehand? And I was again a little bit naive about that. I sort of cycled up a few big hills once or twice, and I cycled out to a few Bowie landmarks actually in London, or just outside of London, because he lived around the areas of Bromley and Brixton. And he'd actually recorded Life on Mars and a bandstand in Beckenham as well. So it felt like the right place to start the trip and get in a little bit of training as well.
So when did you set off? What year are we talking here?
It was 2016, actually. So it was the year he passed away. He was coming on for, when did I leave? In September that year. So the weather was just starting to turn at that point. But that was sort of the only time I could get off work, so I ended up taking all my annual leave in one go, and then a couple of weeks of unpaid leave as well. So I would have liked to have gone in the summer ideally, but it ended up being more autumn time.
This is all very reminiscent of when I set off on my first ride when I cycled to southern Italy, because I set off on a bike that I bought via the cycle to work scheme. I'd never done any cycle touring, any overnight cycle touring, and I was a novice, to say the very least. And also, I hadn't really trained that much. So this is all very reminiscent of what I experienced back in 2010. So you flew down to Ibiza in that September of 2016 and started cycling.
Yeah, I cycled to City Airport in London, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I hadn't bought a bike box for my bike, so I'd found a £10 plastic bag on Amazon that was a giant bag basically, and took the pedals off, and there was some really kind airport staff who laughed at me, but then managed to let me get it on the plane anyway. Unfortunately, it turned up in one piece at the other end, but yeah, so it was going from something like 15 degrees in England, landing in Ibiza where they're having a bit of a renaissance of a summer, and I think it was about 35 degrees when I touched down. and was kind of at a bit of a loss what to do in Ibiza. I hadn't actually found anything David Bowie related there. So I decided to go to the hippie area of Ibiza, stay away from sort of like the club area, and try and channel his inner hippie phase as a starting point for the trip.
That's an interesting point. So, although he mentions it in his lyric, there is, as far as you know, no connection between David Bowie and Ibiza.
That was kind of like the part of the thing that, I don't know, was one of the reasons for the trip. It was like the lyrics in the song Life on Mars are very, very surreal. And people have pored over them for years and years, like trying to find their own meaning within them and trying to find any sense of what these lyrics mean. Because things like Mickey Mouse has grown up a cow, sailors fighting on the dance floor, things like that. And someone had made up the theory that Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads is following the mice in their million hordes. And it's talking about mass tourism. And that was someone's theory about that. So I guess that makes me a mass tourist in that case if I ended up doing that route. But
yeah, and also I suppose if there is a mass tourism connection, then Ibiza fits in with that because it's a popular holiday destination, obviously. So yeah, perhaps. I would imagine the first thing you had to do after you'd been to the hippie place on Ibiza was jump on a ferry back to the mainland, yeah?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So I was looking to obviously find my way to the Norfolk Broads by hook or by crook or crossing, zigzagging across Europe. So I cycled back to the ferry port in Ibiza, and there's a ferry you can take to Barcelona. I think it's about 4 hours, and it's a really, really calm crossing actually, and it's super cheap with a bike. And I think when I got on there, I actually got upgraded to a cabin, which was nice as well, because it gave me a chance to kind of figure out what I was doing with my bike bags and try and pack things in some kind of order. But that was one of the nice parts of the trip, actually. When you get to the other end, you don't have to wait to queue up for your car or anything like that. You can literally get on your bike and roll down the ramp, and you're into the city within 10 minutes. So it's quite an exhilarating sort of start to maybe the proper cycling part of the trip.
Right, so I've got your map in front of me. If anybody wants to see your map, incidentally, you can see it on your Instagram page, which is at Bowie_by_bicycle, and there's a picture of your map there. So you head off, well, in a northerly direction into France, towards Switzerland, Paris. Can you talk about that first leg between Barcelona and Paris?
So the weather was really nice at that point. I think I got a bit of a false sense of what it was going to be like for the whole trip. I cycled along the coast from Barcelona up to Figueres, where the Salvador Dali Museum was, and tried to find some meaning in the surreal museum there to the Bowie lyrics. Apparently they shared a lover throughout the years. And then it became quite hilly. It's basically I had to cross the Pyrenees at La Pertus. Was quite unprepared for that, but I think it was about 1,300 meter climb, which is slow and steady. And I was overtaken by an old man on a bicycle, which I later worked out was an electric bike. But yeah, it was kind of trying to find these places of Bowie interest along the way. So the Dali Museum was one of the first ones, the sort of surrealism of Bowie's lyrics. And then I got into France and was going to places like Nîmes, which is where he played a show on Bastille Day, and started heading up north towards Switzerland. But there was quite a few sort of surprising little moments along the way. Like I think it wasn't just, I was expecting it more to be like, oh, it's going to be 300 miles till I hear something about Bowie next. But people are often stopping you and asking you what you're doing. And I didn't really see any reason to lie about it. So I'd often end up chatting to them about David Bowie. And if they didn't know him, I'd play him a song and they'd be pretending they were interested in the story. And then sometimes you get a bit of good fortune along the way. I think I sat down really tired one day, and I'd run out of water in the middle of nowhere in France. And I saw on the map there was this place called Saint-Pierre-le-Roch. By coincidence or David Bowie fate, Pierre Leroch was actually the guy who invented the lightning bolt insignia, which is probably the thing, I think, the bit of iconography everyone associates most with Bowie himself. It's on the front of the Aladdin Sane album cover. So I thought in my great wisdom, I'd cycle up the Ardèche Mountains, which was 13 kilometers uphill, to see if there's any truth or trace in this being Bowie's famous makeup man. And of course, there wasn't at all. So yeah, it was a very thirsty, dehydrated day after that. But it was a really nice moment along the way, just this bit of serendipity. And as I moved up towards Switzerland, where he basically lived for 20 years.
And in Switzerland, you visited the place where he got married. Was it in Lausanne?
Yes, it was in Lausanne Town Hall. So he lived around that area for quite a long time in these big houses at the top of very big hills. So there was a lot of hill cycling at that time. And he got married to Iman in the town hall in Lausanne at the time. And I kind of cheated my way in, shall I say, to the town hall. I said I was doing research for a document and would they mind if I looked at the wedding room. And a little man who's quite Napoleon-esque, actually, he refused me entry at first. And then I explained what I was doing to the woman on reception, and she demanded to the man that I be let in to look at the room. So, yeah, that was quite nice. And there was lots of other things around there. It's a really beautiful place to cycle around Lake Geneva. At the end, there's a place called Montreux on the northern side of the lake where Queen had a recording studio. And that was where Bowie and Queen recorded Under Pressure together. It was meant to be after this crazy night of a whirlwind of alcohol and drugs, and somehow they knocked out this, world famous, enduring classic at the same time. That was the rock and roll legend anyway.
So you got to Paris. Now, in Paris, looking at your map, it looks as though you took a flight to, is it Moscow? And then headed west from Moscow back in the direction of Berlin and eventually the Norfolk Broads. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the route I took. I actually took a train from Paris to Moscow and then from Moscow back to Berlin. It's this really fantastic train, actually. It's very modern. And I think it's part of the old Trans-Europe Express, which is sort of famous in Kraftwerk, a Kraftwerk song which name checks like Bowie and Iggy Pop. But yeah, it's like 3 days, 2 nights, the train, and I was sort of packed on with my bike, which I wasn't sure whether you were allowed to take on at all or not. So it caused quite a stir when I came on with this bike, and it was in like a tiny little cabin where 4 people were meant to be sleeping. On the way back, 2 women came on and just started shouting at me. They said, "Niet, niet, niet," which is no, 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 and pointing at the bike. So I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be stuck in Moscow here with my bike, and how am I going to get it back to Western Europe again? The security guards came on the train and they were sort of like trying to figure out what the problem was, but they could only speak German, and I only speak very basic German. So it was quite the situation, and I was trying to calm it down by playing them David Bowie songs, which was a bit silly. But yeah, we ended up, after having to spend 2 or 3 days together, they ended up being absolutely lovely. One was like an ex-Soviet ballerina, and we were trying to communicate through music on our phones, and she ended up playing me quite a lot of Chris Rea songs for some reason. But yeah, it was quite a nice musical exchange along the way.
What's the Moscow connection with David Bowie?
He visited there a couple of times. He apparently had a fear of flying, so he'd taken the Trans-Siberian Express all the way back from Japan across Europe. So he'd stopped off in Moscow at one point. And I think he'd got quite a lot of inspiration from the sort of communist Soviet era, and it kind of informed some of his albums. So things like Diamond Dog. Diamond Dogs is a lot about dystopian life, and it was Bowie's take on being in Moscow. He eventually came back there and played a concert in the Kremlin Palace. But I think he said it was one of his worst ever concerts because the crowd was so cold to him. They didn't really applaud him or anything like that. So yeah, I think he went a couple of times with mixed results, but he vowed never to play there again after that, and I don't think he ever did.
How did you find cycling from Moscow back to Berlin? What was that like?
So I did actually take that on the train. That was the return train leg. So I think we passed through Belarus and Poland on the way back. So there's another connection with a Bowie song there. He's got a song called Warsaw, which is Warsaw. I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly. That's another sort of famous song. And he was rumoured to have stepped off this train onto the Warsaw train platform and walked into the city centre and bought a record of a Balkan boys choir. And that apparently inspired some of the sounds on the album, which is all kind of like unusual chanting in an invented language. So there were all these little connections on the way back to Berlin. So
what was the reason why you took the train? Why didn't you cycle from Moscow to Berlin?
I think it was purely a time thing, because I had a limited time frame to do it, and there was a lot of gaps as well in between sort of Germany and Moscow. I think it's a many thousand miles, I think. So I think, although I might have bumped into a few people who had or hadn't heard of him, it would have just taken me too long, and I don't think there would have been any sort of Bowie connections there as such. His music was actually banned in Russia at the time as well, so I don't know. I think the more modern people would have heard of him, but less so much the Soviet era.
So you arrive in Berlin. Now, the connection between Bowie and Berlin is quite strong, isn't it? He spent quite a few years living there, and from what I understand, he was trying to win himself off drugs at the time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So he'd had a phase in the 70s where he pretty much kind of almost killed himself. He was this skeletal man who was living in Los Angeles at the time, and he had like cocaine psychosis and was seeing things in the bottom of swimming pools and thinking witches were falling from windows outside his hotel room. So he's in quite a bad place. And I think he'd heard from, the rock and roll scene that Berlin was kind of this interesting place at the moment, with the wall being up there and the situation that was going on with the communists and the Western world. And it was kind of very edgy for artists at the time. So I think he kind of made a decision to go there and live liberally and get inspiration from, he always sought inspiration from unusual situations. And I guess, and he kind of went there to get clean, apparently. But I think it was actually the drugs capital of Europe at that point. So I don't know if that was an honest intention or not. But he basically moved there with Iggy Pop, who was in the same situation as him. They got an apartment together in Berlin, and they wrote, they painted, they made music together. I think there's a famous thing, it's known as his Berlin Trilogy album set, the Triptych it's called in German. And he recorded a couple of those albums there. He didn't actually record them all there, but he did a few of them there. And I think a lot of the inspiration came from living in Berlin at the time.
It probably was a hotbed of drugs, I would have thought, in the 1970s when he was there. But also, if you want to wean yourself off drugs, do you go and live with Iggy Pop? I mean, that's probably not the best decision ever.
No, I think there's quite a few crazy stories of them coming out, getting into a few scrapes and sort of hell-raising experiences. Iggy Pop was sort of found outside a restaurant writhing naked in snow, and Bowie and Iggy Pop were driving around a car park at 80 miles an hour off their heads on cocaine. And he wrote a song about it called Always Crashing in the Same Car, but I don't think he did crash because it ran out of petrol, and apparently they just burst out laughing. But I guess when you rock and roll, you can get away with those kind of things.
You called your bike Iggy?
I did, yeah. It seemed sort of fitting at the time, like to have a sidekick or a companion who hung around with Bowie. I don't know if my bike was as much of a hellraiser or a bad influence or not. He was a very faithful companion, though. So, yeah, it seemed like a fitting name.
Right. So you're in Berlin and you're now kind of not that far from the Norfolk Broads. Tell us about that final section from Berlin to the Norfolk Broads.
I think it was coming into October at that point, and Berlin had been fantastic for the going to learn about Bowie and finding places where he'd recorded songs. Like I went to the Hansa Studios where he recorded Heroes. There was a lot of museums and art galleries that had inspired him there. There was a bridge that was apparently, when the Berlin Wall fell, he wrote about in a song called Where Are We Now later on, called Bostbrücke. So that was like a real gold mine of Bowie stuff. And then leaving Berlin after that, it's a long, long way back because it's quite far east in Germany. And the weather had decided it was very much going to be autumnal, and the temperature was dropping quite rapidly. It was rainy. This is where there were big, long stretches where the Bowie stuff was a little bit more thin on the ground, and there was so many different directions you could take to try and seek that out. Do you go north? Do you go south? So I ended up going quite far west to Cologne and Dusseldorf and places like that, which is a long old way from Berlin, and just sort of wild camping along the way and trying to stay out of the rain, basically. Yeah, when I got to Cologne and Dusseldorf and those kind of areas. This was a big sort of like influence on Bowie's music. It was called krautrock in England, and it was this kind of new sound of music coming out of Germany at the time, which actually really went on to be influential for a lot of English musicians. So it was bands like Kraftwerk had a studio in Dusseldorf, and there was Can and Neu. And I ended up cycling down to Cologne to find this old recording studio, which was supposedly the home of krautrock. And there was this producer called Conny Plank who'd lived there. And he was quite an interesting guy. He was sort of like would only ever work with interesting artists. So apparently he'd sort of turned down U2 because he didn't like Bono at all. He absolutely hated him. I think he also refused to work with David Bowie, or his wife had said don't work with him because of his drug problem. So it was, quite an out there part of the trip. And I sort of befell a few incidents along the way. I lost my phone at that point. Yeah, the weather was getting very cold. I think I'd rolled my bike through some human excrement at one point as well. It was starting to get that point where I was going a little bit crazy myself.
On the topic of accommodation, you mentioned while camping there. Is that what you'd done since leaving Ibiza?
I'd always planned to camp where possible. And because of the sort of like random nature of the route, it wasn't necessarily always along. I know there's things like Eurovelo, which have, the campsites marked out along them. But I often found myself in places where there was just nowhere to stay. I was in the middle of nowhere. So I'd have to sort of end up huddling behind some trees or trying to sort of shield myself away from the roads and just popping up the tent. But it tended to get dark quite early because it was winter time. So I'd be sort of sat in my tent at 6:30 at night, wondering if anyone was going to come and kick me out of the field or find me. So there was a portion of the trip that was like that, just sort of getting to the point where it's dark and trying to get off the road and find somewhere to sleep. A few times there was, campsites aplenty in places like Holland, and they were really welcome sometimes, after a long day of cycling when you just want a cold beer and a hot shower. That's always something to look forward to at the end of the day. But yeah, a few times when I was in cities, I stayed in hostels in Berlin and Moscow. And then I had one night in a hotel in Paris to treat myself as well. So it was a bit of a mix, really.
The guy you were talking about a few minutes ago, was his name Conny?
Conny Plank, yeah.
Had he met David Bowie?
So, yeah, I think there's a bit of a myth around the whole story. Apparently, he was the only man or one of the only men to refuse to work with David Bowie. So he'd wanted this very famous German producer to work on his Germany-inspired records, basically. Bowie had supposedly gone to his farmhouse, which was 30 miles outside of Cologne, and kind of, tried to get him to work with him. But for one reason or another, the story I got told was that Conny Plank's wife wasn't too keen on having this disheveled, potentially raucous rock and roll drug user around the farm at the time. So he theoretically didn't get to work with him directly, but Bowie was also working with a producer at the time called Brian Eno, and he ended up working with Conny Plank himself. And I think he learned a lot of production skills from working with this guy, Conny Plank, and ended up transferring them onto Bowie's Berlin trilogy, which is why he's borrowed or been influenced by this sound that he wanted to get on the records, and which comes through quite strongly in those artistic and groundbreaking records that he made in the late 70s.
I think I might have misunderstood this. Did you meet Conny Plank or not?
He'd actually passed away, so I'd gone to see where the studio was. So he died of cancer, I think, probably about 10 years ago now, maybe 8 or 9 before I took the trip. But I wanted to see if the studio was still there where this quite revolutionary music was coming from at the time. But I got to this tiny little village, 30 kilometers outside of Cologne, and there was nothing there apart from cows chewing grass, basically. Yeah, I think it had been bulldozed a long time ago, the studio, unfortunately. I tried to ask a few locals, but yeah, it didn't seem to be there anymore.
Did you meet anybody from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads via Paris, Moscow, Berlin, etc.? Did you meet anybody and speak to anybody who had actually met or knew David Bowie when he was in those particular places?
No, I tried to along the way. I'd got sort of in contact with people at some of the studios, and I'd been into one outside of Paris It was a place called the Honky Chateau, and a lot of famous artists recorded there, like Pink Floyd, Fleetwood Mac, like the Grateful Dead, and Elton John had an album named after it as well. And I got into there. I actually told them I was a BBC travel journalist, which was a small white lie. And when I got there, the mayor of the village had turned up to meet me as well. But somehow, yeah, by hook or crook, I managed to get myself inside and got a tour of the studio where he recorded the album Low, which is kind of one of his most sort of celebrated in creative terms. And the original piano that they recorded all the famous bands I just mentioned was still there. The guy who owns the studio now started to play it, and it was just the most amazing sound. It was a really emotional moment, thinking that like Bowie had played that piano, and it just sounded incredible in the studio as well. And he was a very good piano player as well. And I think I might have shed a little tear at that point, but I tried to hide it. But yeah, that was kind of one of the closest I got. And sorry, to answer your question a little more directly, I guess, I'd actually tried to meet Rick Wakeman, who was the pianist on Life on Mars. So it's a really beautiful bit of playing. And Rick Wakeman was a classical pianist, so it'd always be fantastic. And he actually lived towards the end of the trip. He lived not too far from Norfolk. I think he lived in Suffolk at the time. So I had the brainwave that I'd knock on his door and try and explain this stupid trip to him, or this crazy trip to him. And that was kind of going to be one of the, maybe a fitting end to the trip. But when I got near his house, it was very sort of stalkerish. I almost chickened out a bit, and I looked up online to see if there's any information about what he'd been doing recently. And he was actually away on a world tour at the time with his band called Yes, who'd been in for many years. So I thought along that way there was, I wasn't going to quite meet someone who'd played with him or anything like that. And actually, after I got home, I'd come back, and I think it was only about a month later, and I was on the tube in London, just stood on the escalator, and I looked behind me, and Rick Wakeman was actually on the escalator behind me. So I'm not an overly confident guy. I wouldn't just bowl up to him and start, a conversation, but I felt like it was too much of a coincidence not to say something to him. So I let him walk past me when he got out of the tube station, and I said, I've got to say something to him at least. And poor Rick, obviously. And I caught up with him eventually, and I said, excuse me, are you Rick Wakeman? Obviously knowing he was Rick Wakeman, and he was very patient and kind, and he said, yes, I am. And I said, oh, this is a bit crazy, but I did this trip around a David Bowie lyric, and obviously you played on the song. And I just wanted to say thank you, and I wished him a Merry Christmas. And he was lovely. He was off to the BBC to record some Bowie covers, I think, actually, for the Simon Mayo show. But yeah, it felt like a really nice ending to the trip, having met someone and shook someone's hand, the guy who played piano on Life on Mars.
So you did meet somebody who had actually known David Bowie?
Yeah, it was a month after the trip had finished, so I cycled all that way to not meet anyone until after I got back to London in the end, which I probably should have known. But yeah, it was a really nice ending to the trip. And obviously he's such a big part of that song. The piano, drives a lot of the song. And I think it's quite a famous part of it.
The obvious question now is, you've done one line, one lyric from David Bowie. You must have, in the last 3 or 4 years, you must have sung in the shower more lyrics from David Bowie, from other people perhaps. Have you come up with any more ideas as to more cycles that you can do in the future?
Oh, God. Yeah, I guess there could be a few. They had an album called Station to Station. I guess you could do one around that, pick 2 train stations on opposite sides of a continent or the world and do it that way. That was another famous sort of 70s album. What are the songs with lyrics? I think New York and London have sort of got some of the songs most named after them, New York and London. But there's a Beach Boys song called Kokomo, which lists a lot of Caribbean places, which will probably be a bit warmer to do, more interesting. I think it's Aruba, Jamaica. Oh, I want to take you to Bermuda, Bahama.
Have you done any cycle touring since you finished that trip?
I haven't actually. I planned to do another trip a couple of summers ago, and I ended up getting stuck into writing a book about this trip. But I planned to go to Denmark and sort of cycle around. I think there's a headland where you can cycle around. You can wild camp or free camp all the way around. And you can take a ferry from Harwich to a place called Esbjerg, I think it is. And when we were young, we took a family holiday there. But yeah, that was kind of an idea one summer. And then as it started to gather momentum, like the Bowie trip did, I looked up the ferry, to try and do some logistical plans. And the ferry had stopped running about 10 years ago. So that kind of kiboshed that one pretty quickly. But I do want to do it again. Yeah. And I don't know if maybe I need more inspiration to find a route, or I should just cycle a point to point, make it a bit easier on myself.
Keep singing lyrics until you stumble upon something that you could emulate on your bike.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned the book. Is that going to be published? Is that going to be self-published? What's the story with the book?
I'm trying to figure it out. So I finished it now. It's all done. It's kind of, as I guess I've talked about quite a lot, it's a lot about Bowie history and obviously the travelogue element of the trip. And just sort of like, thinking that anybody can get out there and do something like this, whether it's you just need a bit of inspiration, whether that's a picture of a beautiful place or a song lyric. But yeah, the book's written, so it's trying to figure out what to do next with it. Yeah, I'd love to get it published one day, and I don't know whether that would be self-published or traditional. Need to look into those options.
Nowadays, in terms of travel writing, and certainly probably in terms of cycle travel writing, it helps if you've got some kind of twist to what you did. And certainly your journey from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, you could even call the book From Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Have you given it a name?
Yeah, that's the working title at the moment, From Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. I think I had a Bowie bike odyssey as the second part of it, but yeah, it's the working title at the moment. I guess it makes the most sense, and hopefully I think a few people would know that lyric. If not, the song is incredibly famous.
I think that's a fascinating tale, and I think it's an excellent way of coming up with a interesting, innovative, different way of deciding where to go on a cycle trip. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been great chatting about it.
Right, James, we're back in 2025. That was 5 years ago, summer of 2020, when we recorded that. So that's the summer of COVID, isn't it? Yeah. What has happened since?
It's funny you should say that. I've just had COVID for the very first time a couple of weeks ago. So I was one of the last people to get it in that time, which really knocked me out. But in terms of cycling, it's been a long journey since the bike journey I originally undertook, which we've just spoken about or revisited. But I've been trying to, in the meantime, get a book published about the story, and it's gone through its own mega journey as well along the way. But fortunately, that's at an end now because the book was just released a week or two ago at the start of October. My Bowie bike ride story from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, a Bowie Odyssey, is now on bookshelves, which is a relief and a nice new chapter to the story.
So you mentioned in the original interview, you mentioned writing the book. Presumably it was written back in 2020, 2021.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the original version I'd had written 5 years ago. So it's been through a process of trying to find a literary agent and a publisher in the meantime. And I was fortunate enough to find both at the end of last year, which has sort of led to this point now. And it's obviously the story's been through a few different iterations. Like it's been edited. They've told me to take out all the different sandwiches I was eating by the side of the road and include a little bit more detail here and there. I ate some really good sandwiches, but they're not all included in the book now. But there's a lot more freshness to it as well, having had a professional editor's eye on it. So it's changed a little bit from 5 years ago.
And is there a particular Bowie anniversary coming up? I'm just trying to think. Am I correct in thinking he died in 2016?
That's right, yeah. So it's actually in January 2026. It'll be the 10th anniversary of his passing. And it would have been I think he died on 2 days after his 69th birthday. So it would be his 79th birthday 2 days before that. So that his birthday was the 8th of January and the his passing was the 10th of January. So it was, yeah, it's gone really quickly, that time period, because it doesn't seem that long ago I was doing the trip or writing the book, but yet a decade will have passed, in a few months' time.
Yeah, so it's in terms of the timing of the book, it's actually an appropriate time to actually get it published. The original journey. Remind us when the original journey took place.
So the original journey was in 2016. So I think I set off in September and was back late October. And then the book, yeah, has kind of taken up all the time after that, a few years to write it. And then a lot of time trying to find a literary agent and a publisher, a lot of near misses, a lot of unlucky bits and bobs here and there, until we finally got to this point. As you mentioned, it's 10 years now. So there is some nice sort of, also sad symmetry to it, but hopefully more in a celebratory manner.
When we spoke, it was already 5 years after his death. It was 4 years, probably more than 4 years after you'd actually done the journey, and it's now 5 years since we spoke. Have you been able to include in the book anything else, any extra information? Did you get in contact with any extra people? Did people come forward to talk to you about their own experiences or their own stories? Is there anything extra in the book that you've actually been able to add in the last 5 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, that, actually, because of the amount of time that's passed. And when I was revisiting the book to edit it afresh, obviously detail slips from the memory over time. And I got back in touch with a few people I'd met along the way who owned various music studios where Bowie had recorded, and people I'd met along the way, from all over the world. Just to sort of like recall, the conversations we had at the time, and even from their memory, their perspective as well. And it just helped me sort of embellish the detail of the things we talked about, and obviously the stories about Bowie's, one of his most famous songs, Life on Mars. And a lot of the conversations at the time were about, what does this song mean to you, or what do you think the song means? So it was just kind of revisiting those points to kind of like create this thread in the book, because it's the mysterious meaning of the song. And that's sort of ultimately part of my personal journey, these kind of surreal, impenetrable lyrics that he sings of, which is sort of like the narrative thread of the story. And it becomes the ending in essence, what it means to other people and what it meant to me as well. So it was really nice to reconnect with those people also, 5-10 years on, and hear what they're up to now, and their memories of the trip.
And in terms of the cycling, bearing in mind this is a cycling podcast, is it something that you've continued doing? Have you done any more cycling since we spoke in 2020?
Yeah, I was always, I think on the original recording, I said I was a casual cyclist. I cycle into work there and back most days. Obviously, we don't have to go to work as much anymore. We're in and out of offices, but I've tried to keep in with the long distance ones, and I've done a few trips. Nothing as mega or epic as the Bowie trip, but I've cycled coast to coast in Devon, for example, from the north to the south, and found out how incredibly hilly Devon is. Beautiful as well at the same time, obviously. But yeah, that was one trip, which was a really nice trip, actually. It was like from the most northernmost point to the most southernmost point in Devon, and jumped in the sea at the end. And then I think I've also taken a sort of multi-day trip from Somerset, where I grew up, cycling back to London, where I currently live as well, which wasn't as glamorous or as beautiful as Devon, unfortunately. But there were still some really nice parts along the way, using the canals that connect like Reading to London, and obviously going through sort of Somerset, Wiltshire. I camped next to Stonehenge, alongside some druids and wizards along the way. So yeah, I'm still trying to keep in, one trip a year, like, a decent length to keep the energy in the legs and keep them fresh. And yeah, now the book's been published, maybe think about the next one, and maybe a bit more of an epic trip again.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next question, is the fact that, the publishers will want, presumably, if this is a success, and let's hope it is, they will want a sequel. So where will the sequel take you from and to?
That's the big question. Yeah, I mean, I've actually been sort of researching different lyrics, as the Bowie one was all about, lyrics from one place to another, from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. So there's a multitude of songs that contain those lyrics, and lots of other songs that have distance, Walking 500 Miles by the Proclaimers. So I think I'd like to, keep in with the musical and cycling theme. So it's just finding that perfect song or band that I really love, to carry that off now. So I think that'll be when the excitement over the book launch settles down. That'll be the next task for me, and to get back on the road with some music not far behind me, bringing in my ears.
Before we sign off, it is when I was re-listening to that interview, it was part of an episode of this podcast. It's number 23, by the way, if anybody wants to go back and listen to the whole podcast, because you were talking about your particular journey. There was another guy in there who was talking about having travelled. He'd broken a world record for travelling to the most countries in 7 days, I think it was, which involved him travelling through lots of bits of kind of Europe where there's lots of countries. And I also spoke to Rob Ainsley, who I've known for a long time. He's the guy who actually makes the music for this podcast, although at the time, back in the days of episode 23, there was no music, but there is now, which you'll hear when you obviously listen to this episode. And I was chatting to him in a pub in somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales, and we just listened to what you'd recorded, and then I said to him, can you think of any other ideas for lyrics or for journeys based upon lyrics? And this is what he had to say. Can you think of any other lyrics that might inspire cycle touring journeys? We talked in the interview about Simon and Garfunkel, because they come up with lots of places, well, for example, the song America, but they tend to talk about lots of different places they've visited. How about the Beatles? Could cycle down Penny Lane, I suppose, but that wouldn't get you very far.
Yes, and of course a lot of the lyrics in America are based on what actually happened when Paul Simon was going out with this English girl called Kathy Kitty, who is the Kathy of Kathy's song, and who he's thinking about in Homeward Bound. So there could well be a kind of Simon and Garfunkel songbook trail that you could put together. Certainly some of the rides I've done have been a bit like James, that I've started out with some completely arbitrary premise. One of them was rhyming rides. I just started out one day, I was talking with some of my friends, we'd done Land's End John O'Groats, and we were thinking, what else could we do, especially a side-to-side? Is there some kind of westernmost to easternmost point? And somebody suggested Barmouth to Yarmouth. So Barmouth in Wales to Great Yarmouth. And we thought, this is a great idea. So I ended up doing it by myself, Barmouth to Yarmouth. And then I thought, what else can you do that rhymes? So it's got to be a coast to coast. You can't just do York to Cork or something like that. So I did Barrow to Jarrow, and Lynmouth to Teignmouth, and Poole to Goole. And they were all great. And there was something about this arbitrary nature, very much like with James's trip, that as I went along, I just had these experiences and people that I met and places that I went en route, from starting with this totally arbitrary two endpoints and just seeing, well, if I make up the rules as I go along and make up the route as I go along, what's going to happen?
Perhaps that's what Sustrans should do. They should, rather than making logical decisions based upon evidence of where people want to cycle, perhaps they should do Goole to Poole and
I guess Lynmouth to Teignmouth.
Lynmouth to Teignmouth. But I think that's a brilliant idea.
Yes, and they all turned into great rides, precisely because I didn't know what was going to happen. There was nothing like it. There was no clue as to what it was going to be like. But in a place like Britain, as we know, a place that's so full of varied scenery and history and stories and people, you can go between pretty much any two places and you're going to probably have a good time.
I think tomorrow, when I continue my journey, because tomorrow you're heading back to York and I'm heading off in the direction of the Lake District, I'm going to pass through every single place that I pass through and trying to think of somewhere which rhymes with it. So as to Kendal, for example, I've got to pass through Kendal. What rhymes with Kendal?
Pendle to Kendal. They're not on the coast, but actually that would be quite a nice ride, Pendle to Kendal.
Well, it's not very far. Pendle to Kendal, is it?
It's not, but you could get in maybe the Forest of Bowland and some of the Howgills. So yeah, you could put together quite a nice route there.
So James, what do you think? He's got lots of rhyming places there, but he also did mention some potential song lyrics. Simon and Garfunkel, for example. Any inspirational ideas?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting theme. There's lots of different ways you could approach it. Like Rob came up with some really sort of witty routes, and there were other sort of like things like the Dubliners, who this was a song about them looking for work, and they took the rocky road to Dublin, for example. So you could probably pick any point in Ireland and finish in Dublin at the end. What else would there be? Like, obviously you mentioned the Beatles earlier on, like Penny Lane, like McCartney's Long and Winding Road could go from one point to another. Or, if you're going from a tough point in your life, maybe like Ozzy Osbourne's Ride to Insanity on Crazy Train, that song there. But yeah, I think there's lots of different ways you could approach it, and just, recreate these kind of fun stories within that. So, like I say, I think that'll be my next task, finding a kind of a quirky route that would create some sort of song lyrics or musical connection, but would always finish with a pint at the end, like you and Rob had that time.
Yeah. Well, it's I think it's an inspirational story whereby you've taken your passion for your musical hero, you've done something clearly very, very memorable, and now you've actually managed to finally write and get published a book from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Presumably you can buy this in bookshops. It has been published and on Amazon, presumably. I did notice, actually, when I was looking at Amazon earlier, one of the reviews was by Richard Skinner. Is that the Richard Skinner?
Oh, I don't know. Who would be the famous Richard Skinner?
Well, Richard Skinner, the DJ. When I was growing up, he was a DJ on Radio 1, Richard Skinner.
It may well be. I don't know, actually. I haven't looked. I'll try and stay off at the moment just in case. But I'll have to check that out. Yeah, hopefully left a good review for it.
Well, he did. I mean, there are, I think, a few. I mean, bearing in mind, when was it actually officially published?
Only a few weeks ago now, yeah, so a couple of weeks back.
So presumably people are still reading it, but the reviews that are on there are all very, very good reviews. So I wouldn't hesitate to go and read them. But if it is the Richard Skinner, who was I'm pretty sure he was a Radio 1 DJ back in the 80s, you've actually found a fan in somebody in the musical world. So, well, good luck with the book and good luck with any future ventures on two wheels or off two wheels, following your musical heroes.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Really lovely to chat again.
So there we go. That was James Briggs again after 5 years. If you are somebody who has appeared on the Cycling Europe podcast and your story has got an ending or a continuation, then please do get in contact and perhaps you can come back on as well. If you're interested in telling your new story, then please do get in contact. All the contact details are at cyclingeurope.org/contact. And if you'd like to support the podcast, all the details are at cyclingeurope.org/support. Thank you to James. Thank you to Rob Ainsley for his contribution, not just musical contribution, he's the guy who makes all the music, but also for his contribution 5 years ago in that pub in the Yorkshire Dales. I'll be back with episode 95 of the Cycling Europe podcast at some point, hopefully very soon. In the meantime, thanks for listening and happy cycling.